Thanks very much, Dave. Usually when I come to these things, it's to give a technical presentation because Dave's triple booked, so he's speaking somewhere and Nikki's speaking somewhere else. So it's really weird to have both of them in the room as well. However, this is not the technical presentation, as Dave said, it's more a commercial thing. And I've got, as he said, about 30 plus years experience of selling large-scale capital plant into technical projects. And if you think that the contract is kind of irrelevant, you know, they're all the same, really I have to say to you, think again, because it absolutely defines the difference between the projects that I look back on over my career that have been highly successful from the client's perspective, that he gets something that he's really happy with, versus the ones that have been kind of a battle all the way and nobody's really satisfied at the end of it. And it's the contract that in many cases makes the difference there. So it really is important in terms of the success of the project. So the first question is, what is a contract? Well, the lawyers would tell you that it's an agreement between two parties who are allegedly of equal standing in terms of negotiating the agreement. So that's a laugh for a start. And who have a common understanding of the content of the agreement, which is also a bit of a joke. So the example that was given in law classes at university, as far as I remember, was the little old lady getting on the bus is entering into a contract with the bus company when she buys a ticket. Is she really of equal standing with the bus company in terms of negotiating that contract? Not really. So there's immediately scope for a bit of a clash and a bit of tension in the form of contract. However, it is really important that the contract is genuinely balanced. If you think of it as being like a seesaw, it's important that the seesaw is relatively level. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about two types of contract. There are contracts that are based on suspicion, and there are contracts that are based on trust. And probably the room divides into two groups of people as well. People who believe that it's necessary to have a contract based on suspicion, and people who recognize that it is also possible to have a contract based on trust. And if I go back and think again about the contracts in my career that have been the most successful ones for the client, they're the contracts who've been based on trust. And we can maybe talk a little bit more shortly about examples of that. But also contracts fall into two categories. There are model forms of contract, we'll talk a little bit about that, and there are bespoke contracts. And generally you would think having a bespoke contract should be a better thing for your project. Probably not true, because it's been written by one side without input from the other. Probably written by lawyers who've been trying to drive as hard a bargain for their client as possible. And my experience is that the bespoke contracts generally are much less fair to the other party than the model form. The model form typically has been written by a committee representing a broad swathe of industry. So for example, the JCT contracts written by the Joint Contracts Tribunal, which is made up of the Royal Institute of British Architects and the Institution of Civil Engineers and various contractor associations, and it tries to give a level playing field. There's a kind of slice in between the two, which is a client who's taken a model form and has turned it into a bespoke contract by writing modifications and amendments to the contract. And I had one classic case, which was for a brewery in Burton-on-Trent, which was based upon the IMEC model form, but in their amendments to the contract it said, clause 42, delete the word not. And I thought, that's a very interesting modification to the contract. I wonder what clause 42 says. And clause 42 said, the contractor shall not be liable for consequential losses, which is a very fair thing to put into a model form of contract, but deleting the word not was kind of tilting the seesaw fairly severely in one direction. So model form generally good, provided people are willing to play fair. Bespoke contracts, you need to be really wary, and if the bespoke contract has been written in a spirit of mutual cooperation and general backslapping, then that's okay, but it's normally not the case. So you need to be very, very careful. Even with the model forms, there are many varieties. I've already mentioned JCT and IMEC. The JCT form of contract is very, very good for people who are putting up buildings. And building services people who tend to be subcontractors to people who are putting up buildings tend to work to a subcontract under the JCT form. It's really not appropriate for the installation of capital plant that requires a long lead time off-site, because it's fairly typical that the JCT contract will not allow payment for goods until they arrive on site. Building the kind of systems that you've been hearing about today, Dramen, for example, probably has a 6-month lead time in the factory when the equipment is being built before it's shipped to site. And all of that equipment has to be paid for, typically on 30-day payment terms. So not receiving any money until the equipment hits site is tantamount to saying that the equipment manufacturer will act as your bank. Now, as an equipment manufacturer, I can say to you, you would be far better getting your bank to act as your bank than asking me to do it, because I'm not very good at being a bank. So, JCT form of contract tends to lead to some slightly wacky behavior in terms of the funding of the contract. It's much better to go with something like the IMEC model form, which is based upon the supply of capital plant and which will allow for staged payments before the equipment reaches site. Another form of contract which is still called the new engineering contract, NEC, you may have heard of. I have to say I'm quite a fan of the NEC contract because it is much more appropriate for the kind of thing that we do. It has the program built into the contract, it has the payment terms built into the contract in a quite unusual way, and it really does suit what we're doing. So there's three model forms. They are very different. Thinking about one model form when you're actually under a different form, I would liken to setting out the Monopoly board and trying to play Cluedo on it. It just doesn't work. You need to understand the detail of the terms of the contract. However, you don't have to be a lawyer to understand the contract. Generally, it is fairly straightforward. If it doesn't make sense, it probably doesn't make sense. So you should read the contract terms and you should think, does this actually work in my circumstances in practice? We had one contract where the client had written into it in the modifications to the JCT standard form, the architect will exercise his discretion not to pay for goods off-site. And you think, oh, let me unpack that for a minute. The architect will exercise his discretion not to pay for goods off-site. That basically meant that I was having to be his bank because they weren't going to pay us for goods off-site. Then the site was delayed. We built the chillers. It was for a data center. We were ready to deliver the chillers, but the site wasn't ready to accept them. So we'd spent all the money. We were ready to deliver, and they said, hold on, guys, there's going to be a 3-month delay. And we said, well, how do we get paid for the chillers? Because, you know, we need the money. You're asking me now to extend you an increased overdraft in comparison to what I was doing as your bank previously. So the way they got around it, which I thought was quite cute, was they redefined the site boundary to include a warehouse that was half a mile up the road. And we delivered the chillers to the warehouse half a mile up the road, and they were then officially on site, and they were able to pay for them. So there are ways around it, but they put themselves into a hole by having a one-sided contract, basically. So again, I would say it's really important that the seesaw is fairly level in terms of the contract conditions. Now, why in particular is this important for heat pumps and heat networks? And the answer is because heat pumps suffer from what I would describe as brutal economics. Compared with a refrigeration system or a chiller system, which is what we would more traditionally have been involved in, a heat pump is a discretionary purchase. If somebody needs a freezer system for their factory, they need a freezer system. They might buy it from me, they might buy it from somebody else, but they need a freezer system. So they will go out to tender, they'll have a specification, they'll get prices back, and they'll place a contract. However, if we're tendering for a heat pump job, then there are lots of ways of providing the heat. It could be a heat pump, it could be a boiler, it could be biomass, it could be, we've heard of all of them today. It's really important that the capital cost is as low as possible and the efficiency is as high as possible. By imposing contract terms that are unfriendly to the equipment supplier, for example, by asking me to be your bank, you are increasing the capital cost of the project. And if the supplier of the equipment is not paying attention to that kind of detail, they're probably not going to stay in business because they're agreeing to do things that are costing them money and they're not aware of what their costs are. So the contract is really, really important to the heat pump market, much more so than it is even in the refrigeration or the chiller business, because it can make the difference between putting forward a bid which is attractive to the client and putting forward a bid which is kind of ho-hum and opens the door to all sorts of other technologies. So heat pumps, as I say, brutal economics. It has to be as cheap as possible and as efficient as possible. And the two are a direct trade-off, as we've seen already just in Trevor's presentation there. Really important to get the balance right in terms of payback. So what would I recommend in terms of a suitable contract for a heat pump type installation? Well, the answer is back to this question about contracts that are based on suspicion and contracts that are based on trust. A contract that's based on suspicion, it's actually quite easy to tell which those are, because there will be pages and pages, clauses and clauses about indemnities and penalties and what happens when it goes wrong. And in some cases, there's nothing whatsoever about the payment terms in the contract. That might seem strange to you, but I'm expected to take on 5 pages of penalty clauses, and there's nothing about how I'm going to get paid for what I'm doing. That's a contract that's based on suspicion. It's a contract that's based on the expectation that the supplier is going to screw up, and you need to be able to get your clause into them when they do so. On the other hand, a contract based on trust will say, I need you to deliver me a heat pump that is as efficient and as cheap as possible, and in return, I will do the following things for you. I will offer you payment sort of as quickly as I can do it. I'll minimize the impact on your business. I'll take care of you as my supplier. And these contracts are the ones that deliver the project which is most successful in the client's eyes. It might seem strange that it sounds like you're giving something away, but the reality is that you're effectively buying loyalty, and you're engaging with somebody who wants to work with you rather than beating somebody with a big stick and expecting them to toe the line. So the contract itself can drive the project in the trust direction, or it can drive it in the suspicion direction. And as an end user, you're the one that decides which form of contract you're going to choose. So it really, really is significant. It is important.